Listeners, are you ready for your monthly literary adventure? We now have the BFF Book Club. Join us each month to explore a new book. After reading, connect with fellow book lovers and meet the author in a live interview. Can't make it live? Don't worry. We'll send you the recording. You can find all the upcoming book club selections at www.bookishflights.com/read/BFF Book Club. Hi, I'm Kara Infante, and this is Bookish Flights. In each episode, I chat with one bookish guest as we take some time to sample and savor the pairing recommendations from their bookish flight. We hope to give you suggestions to cultivate your TBR list and nurture your leisure time through books. In today's episode, we have Julia Kelly joining us for the BFF Book Club to discuss The Dressmakers of London. Julia is the international best-selling author of emotional historical fiction about extraordinary women and intriguing historical whodunit mystery novels. Her books have been translated into 13 languages. In addition, she's been an Emmy-nominated producer, journalist, marketing professional, and for one summer, a tea waitress. Julia has called Los Angeles, Iowa, a New York City home before settling in London with her husband. Welcome to the show, Julia.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here.
Yes, I am so glad to have you. Well, I start with this question in every episode because I feel like we are
Mhm.
so much more than our bios. Can you tell us a little bit about who you are?
Yeah, well, I think probably the first thing that I usually tell people is my accent doesn't match my location. So I'm born and raised in Los Angeles. I do live in the UK now, and it's a long, twisting story to get there. But I'm lucky enough to actually live where I primarily write about. So I've written a whole bunch of books about the UK. I've written a whole bunch of books about World War II. And so being here has enabled me to do that research. And I really love it. And I think that's what kind of it sums me up as sort of in a nutshell. I'm a big history nerd, and I'm also a big fan of all things British history. So that's a lot of what you get when you read my books.
Yeah. I imagine that you can't help but be inspired by your surroundings when you actually get to live there and you aren't researching from afar.
No, it's true. I think that's probably why I started writing the historical novels that I started with. So my first was The Light Over London, and the inspiration for that came from a few different places, but one of the really big ones was walking around London. I had just moved over. My family is American and British, so I'm lucky enough to have the dual nationality that let me move. And so I was wandering around London, and I kept seeing all of these war memorials. It's impossible to miss them, especially through parts of central London. And I saw memorials to women who served in the war, and that was a big area of my personal knowledge that I just didn't know anything about. I knew bits and pieces about the American side and what women did during the war for the US, but I didn't know much about the UK. And of course, it was not just serving, although women's auxiliary, which is what I write about. I write often about the women's auxiliary branches. So if you hear about the WAF or the Wrens, if you're a fan of historical novels, these
Yeah.
things will come up. But women did a lot of things, especially on the home front. So everything from being land girls, working the fields and taking on agricultural jobs, working in munitions factories. Literally, the expression is keeping the home fires burning. So they
Yeah.
took over businesses and lots of things that I think have gone either uncredited or unknown to a lot of readers. And so one of the great joys of what I do is try to bring some of those stories to the surface and maybe introduce people to aspects of women's history that they wouldn't have necessarily run across in school because it certainly wasn't being taught when I was in school. So it's been such a joy to do that, and even more so to get feedback from readers who were here in London or in the UK during the war. They were children. They remember seeing their family members going off to war. They remember seeing their family members working in factories, serving, and emailing me and saying, that's what it was like. I remember these
Wow.
things, and then sending me these incredible emails with all this detail. And I think to myself, where were you when I was researching all of this? I could have just sat down and had a conversation with you. But it's so rewarding, and I absolutely love that. So it is all drawn from being here, which is such a joy.
Yeah. As you were talking, that's actually what I was thinking about, that it's kind of hard to believe that in history, where I learned in school, I didn't learn about the women, but of course women were going to be touched by the war
Absolutely.
and everybody, the men leaving and then these jobs that are so, I mean, of course that was there, but it was never taught. And like how I never connected the dots of that. Like, of course the women were affected and had to,
Mhm.
like you said, kind of keep the home fires burning. Things still had to go on.
Absolutely. And I think, it's a bit of a unique perspective having come from the United States and then, doing a lot of my academic study when I was in college about British history. It was what I specialized in. But then coming here and understanding the impact of something like the Blitz. So, heavy bombing for a
Yeah.
long period of time. And then there were different waves of the Blitz as well, different stages throughout the war. But the initial Blitz that people think of that happened in 1940 to 1941, you had such large scale destruction of London and other cities that, of course, everybody's lives were touched by this and affected by this. People, they lost property. There was huge displacement of people, a huge housing crisis that happened because of the Blitz. There are so many stories to tell about that, and so many things that I didn't necessarily connect and think about. And then you walk around London, or you talk to somebody. I have friends who say, oh yeah, my grandfather remembers, being bombed out of their house, or one person who I used to work with said, oh, I grew up in Balham in southwest London, and I remember there were still bomb sites when I was a child, and we were playing on the
Wow.
old bomb sites because nothing had been developed in that spot. Well, now Balham is quite an affluent, desirable neighborhood, so of course everything's been built
Wow.
up, and you don't necessarily see that, but if you know what to look for, you can also often tell, there's a historic Georgian building, Georgian building, Georgian building, 1960s block of flats. And that often is because that property
Wow.
was actually bombed and then redeveloped. So it really does touch all aspects of life, especially in the capital, but across the country. There was bombing and, of course, other aspects of the war that affected people no matter where they were.
Yeah, I had an author that I interviewed a couple weeks ago, and she was from Vietnam, and so she came on and talked about, and like she was a child during the Vietnam War, and just I kept thinking, I'm like, as Americans, we can't even possibly understand what when a war comes to your own country, like we can't
No.
even understand that.
Absolutely. And I think it does make you pause as you write these, as I write these books. It does make me pause and think, what would it have been like? What would I have done? I think it's very
Yeah.
natural as an author to try to empathize with your characters in that way and understand a bit more about what their life would have been like, and also what emotionally they would have been feeling as they went through this.
Yeah, I think that's the beauty of reading, though, too, right? Is it helps us develop that empathy. But also, I'm always reading, like, would I have behaved the same if
Yes.
I was put in that similar set of circumstances? So I love doing it as a reader, too.
Yeah,
But
it's wonderful. I think, there's a cliche that reading builds empathy, but I am a very strong believer in that, especially fiction, I think.
yeah, well, for listeners that are maybe tuning in that haven't got to read The Dressmakers of London yet, can you tell them a little bit about it?
Sure. So the book is set in the middle of the war, late 1941, and it's about two sisters who are estranged. They are the daughters of a dressmaker who owns a shop in London, and one sister has gone off and married very well, far above her station, and she has sort of not had much contact with anybody in the family for a number of years. Her name's Sylvia. And then Izzy, her sister, who is younger than her, has stayed at the shop and has been helping her mother run the store, and also has aspirations to design some of the clothes that the customers come in for. She feels a bit like her mother's designs are a bit old fashioned and maybe a bit stodgy, but anyway, so it's not a spoiler because it happens very, very early in the book, but their mother dies. And Izzy, who is expecting, having worked at the shop for years and years, to inherit, actually finds out when the will is read that she and Sylvia have jointly inherited this shop. Sylvia is very happy to entertain the thought of selling her portion of the shop to Izzy, but then conscription for women is enacted by the government, which is a real thing that did happen. And Izzy falls within the window of women who actually had to leave what they were doing and join up. And so she ends up joining the WAF, which is the auxiliary of the Royal Air Force, and she needs somebody to run the shop, and that somebody is Sylvia. So through letters when Izzy is at training camp and then serving, and then as Sylvia is trying to get her arms around what has been going on at the shop, and it turns out maybe it's not as well run as we had hoped. Through letters back and forth, they start to repair their relationship and sort of um, realize the perspective that each has on their estrangement and maybe some of the things that have led to it. So it's really a story about two sisters and that emotional journey they go through. And then also it's a story about clothing rationing because I was so
Yeah.
interested in historical fashion. It's about what it would have been like to try to run a business that is based on garments, clothes, sale of clothes, when people were very restricted in what they could buy because the government was trying to equalize who could actually purchase what when it came to clothes. So it was a fun challenge to write and a good research challenge for me as well.
Yeah, that's I was going to ask if you had any background in clothing because even the descriptions of the fabric and all of that, it like brought it to life for me. And I was like, wow, she does this so well.
Thank you. Well, I've been a knitter for almost all my life,
Okay.
so probably about 30 years at this point. Because I am a sister myself, in true sister fashion, my sister, about a year and a half, 2 years before I started to write this book, she bought herself a sewing machine and decided she wanted to start making her own clothes because she has a very sort of vintagey style, and she wasn't happy with what she was finding in the shop. So I was watching her teach herself how to sew, and I thought, I kind of want to do that. And so I have made some forays into learning how to sew. I am not nearly as good at it as I am at knitting, but I'm learning, which is the important part. So it's challenging. It's much more challenging than I thought it would be, but it's satisfying as well when something finally comes together and looks like a wearable actual garment.
Yeah. The other part that I loved about this, and I don't think I'm giving it too much away, is I love that the sisters each had the opportunity to be able to tell their story. Because I think so often when there are fractured relationships, you don't usually get that, right? Like everybody just kind of goes their separate ways and you just that is what it is. But I loved that their mother had the foresight to, you know, leave them both the shop, that it kind of
Mhm.
forced them to have to come back and then be able to kind of tell their stories of, you know, what went awry and why they made those choices. And I thought that was a very
Yeah.
beautiful part of like redeeming a relationship that I don't know that you often get.
Thank you. Well, I wanted to make sure that both of them had made mistakes in the past and both of them had reasons for making those mistakes. They
Yeah.
thought they were acting in good faith at the time. And I think that's maybe where some of that gray area and a lack of communication can be particularly difficult among sisters. I'm very fortunate. I have a very good relationship with my sister, but I sort of started from the place of what if something had happened that had broken down our relationship, um, what might that have looked like and what might that have felt like? And so trying to give them both a reason, well, especially on Sylvia's side, a reason for wanting to be back in her sister's life, and also a reason for why this, maybe both of them thought they were doing the right thing in the past, but it sort of drove them apart. And then how do I get them to understand each other a little bit more so they can come back together?
Yeah. And I think that so often, I mean, even if you think about someone you've maybe had a falling out with, I think we all do the best with our own, you know, our own history, our own set of circumstances, and we're trying to make the best decision like in that moment. I don't think, I mean, there's maybe some people with ill intention out there, but I don't think
Yeah.
that we start out from that, but it becomes misunderstood, like you said, and it creates this fracture. But how they had that ability to kind of redeem that was great.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, it's funny because there's so much conversation these days about estrangement and no
Yeah.
contact. And I wanted to make it very clear this is not a relationship where it's toxicity on one side and somebody is making that choice to pull away to protect themselves. It's an equal um there are equally good and bad
Yeah.
decisions made by these sisters. And so it's a little bit different than that kind of scenario. But it has driven a wedge between the two of them.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Well, what for the listeners again that maybe haven't picked it up, what is your wish for the readers? What do you hope they'll take away from the Dressmakers of London?
I think with any historical novel, you always hope that people learn something new about the history. And so a lot of readers I've spoken to have said, they didn't know really how clothing rationing, they'd heard about rationing, they weren't entirely sure how it worked. So I'm hoping that people sort of are interested in that. But mostly I hope they enjoy the book. And I hope that when they do read it, it's a part epistolary novel. And so you get these very intimate moments of somebody putting words down on a page that they might not have necessarily said to somebody face to face, which I think is the beauty of letters, right?
Yeah.
And so I hope that people end up really connecting with both sisters. And, I'm sure some people will have their own ideas about who is more right and who is more wrong about the initial conflict. But going ahead and watching that relationship repair, I hope is satisfying.
Yeah. Have you written an epistolary novel before?
I haven't. I've used
Okay.
bits and pieces of documents before. So in The Light Over London, I used a diary as a bit of a narrative device,
Yeah.
but it wasn't all diary entries. And I did that with The Last Garden in England as well. There was a bit of a diary for one of the points of view. It was hard. It was
I was going
hard
to ask
getting
that. Okay.
I'm old enough to remember writing letters, and I don't do it very often anymore. So was definitely tricky getting back into it. But once I kind of decided how they were going to write to each other and sort of what tone they were going to use and how that might change throughout the book, that definitely helped. And then at some point, just sitting down and writing the letters and making myself do it, I think was very helpful.
Yeah, I think that for me, any epistolary novel I will pick up hands down. Like it's just
I
in
love
a
them.
way, I love that type of book. And thanks to I always mess this title up, but the Guernsey, like Literary Potato Peel
Uh,
Pie Society was the first one.
Potato peel. Yeah,
Yeah.
yes. I know the one you're talking about.
That was the first one I ever read like that. And I was like, I absolutely adored this novel. And now I need to
Oh,
read
good.
any other epistolary novel that falls in my path. So thank you for writing that.
Of course, of course. It was
Yeah.
fun. I
Have
enjoyed
you
it
been
very much.
working on any other projects at this point?
I have. So I have two projects, one of which I can talk a bit more about, and the other one
Okay.
is still very early days. And I learned my lesson a long time ago after a big change in edits to a book where I had told people what the book was about, and then it wasn't what the book was about
Yeah.
anymore. So the one that I can definitely talk about is my historical mystery series. It's the Evelyn Redfern series, and the third book in the series comes out in September. It's called A Dark and
Yay.
Deadly Journey. So
Okay.
I've been wrapping up all of the work on that one, which is exciting. And then the other book is my, I believe, 2026 historical novel. So in publishing, you're always working quite far
Yeah.
ahead. And I just finished the first draft of that, which I'm immensely proud of because it was not an easy book to write. And I'm waiting for the edit letter from my editor to see what she thinks of it. So I've got my fingers crossed, and I'm hoping that she loves it. But there's
Yeah.
always comments, and we can make this stronger, we can make this better, and that's the wonderful thing about having an editor.
Yeah. Well, congratulations to you. That sounds like a
Thank you.
great project.
Yes, I enjoyed it very much.
Yay. One last question for you about writing. What have you learned about yourself through writing?
That's a really good question, and you would be surprised. Almost nobody asks that.
Oh, yay.
Um, it's funny. I have always wanted to write. The cliche of a lot of writers. I grew up scribbling stories and wanting to write, and I think one of the things that has been the biggest lesson is learning the discipline of loving something, but also knowing that I need to put in the work and put in the discipline to
Yeah.
actually make that happen. I used to be a journalist, and I used to say, if I don't write, I don't eat. And so that teaches you some discipline.
Yeah.
Fiction is a bit different, and especially I find first drafts the most challenging part of the process because you're taking something brand new that's never existed before, but also you have an idea in your head of what you want it to look like, and you have the perfect idea in your head.
Yeah.
Getting it onto the page is never perfect. And so I think, the discipline of doing that and the discipline of also not getting frustrated with how it could be and it's not there yet, and you just have to sort of have some faith. It's taught me a huge amount of patience uh, and sort of trusting in the process. So it's a bit of a multi-pronged thing.
Yeah, I admire, I mean, how much time you also spend on these projects as well. I feel like for me, I'm not a writer. I've just been a lifelong reader, but I remember like writing in school and I'd like get everything I needed into there and I'm like, I don't want to look at this anymore. But then, I mean, you have to go back for edit after edit. And I mean, especially in a novel, right? I mean, and I'm like, I don't know that I could do that. So I admire you all very much.
There is a stage at which you think to yourself, I could not see this book for a little while and be very happy. And then the nice thing is when it comes around to actually promote the book because the book is out in the world, you think, yeah, actually I'm really proud of this. And I have
Yeah.
enough distance that I'm not, remembering all the moments where I thought, oh, I just need to do one more edit on this, or I just need to polish it in this way. So yeah, you do kind of come back to it again.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad to hear that because that is like a hesitation in my mind. I'm like, I don't know that I could do that.
You never
So
know.
you never know. Well, let's switch gears a little bit and let's talk about who you are as a reader. What type of genres do you enjoy reading?
So it's such a cliche to say that I'm an eclectic reader. I am an eclectic reader, but I definitely have focuses, which I
Yeah.
enjoy very much. So probably not a surprise, a lot of historical fiction. I read a lot of mystery, so often historical mystery, but I have been really loving thrillers recently,
Yeah.
especially in that sort of God of the Woods. I think they're calling it literary thriller sort of
Yeah.
world. I read quite a bit of history as well, and I have actually been thinking about, and this is spurred by a conversation with members of my family. I've been thinking about going back and doing a bit more classics reading. I was a great reader of classics when I was in high school, and I got to college and still was reading a bit of those, but really kind of turned to more contemporary fiction, especially in the last, I'd say, 10 years. So I'm actually reading Vanity Fair right now, which I'm
Yay.
enjoying
Yeah.
immensely. I have never read it before, and it feels like a huge gap in my reading. And it's the whole thing started because my mother, who's one of the most well-read people I've ever met, has decided that my husband, me, my sister, and her husband every Christmas are going to get an improving 19th century novel, and that is to say, a book she wants us to read so that she can talk to us about it. So
I love that. It makes an easy gift for her too.
yeah, absolutely. So mine last year was New Grub Street, which I had never read before.
Oh, I haven't even
Um,
heard of it actually.
Yeah, it's wonderful. It's
Okay.
wild. And a lot of fun. And unfortunately, the author's name is Gissing, I think. I'll double check that. But
Yeah, we'll have
um,
it in the show notes too.
yeah, so I had that, and my husband had The Way We Live Now by Anthony Trollope, and it's just meant that we have all these books to talk about now.
Yeah.
And so more and more the family conversation around books has been around classics, and Vanity Fair came up the other day. It's one of my father's favorite books, and so I thought, I really do need to read that. So
Yeah.
it's sitting on my bedside table right now, and I'm going through Becky Sharp's adventures at the moment.
Yeah. Well, listeners or even me, I'm like, oh, what a great idea as a
Isn't
mom
that a
for my
great? I
kids.
know. And the
To
best
give.
part is you get to give somebody a gift and then you have the benefit of getting to talk to them about it because it's a book that you yourself enjoyed. So there you
Yeah.
go.
Yeah. You're like building your own little book club within your family. I love
Yeah.
that.
Completely selfish, but wonderful.
Yeah. I did a few years ago, which I'm still not done. I should even look back to when I started this. I did a what was 100 years in great books or something, and I was trying to
Ooh,
read a book of every year for the past 100 years, or a century of great books. That's what I called
that's
it.
a nice idea.
And actually, one of the books you brought today was How I Found It, because I was like, what book came out in 1952 or whenever that book came out? And I came across that one, and it really challenged me to read a lot of books. And I was so pleasantly surprised by even books from the 30s or the 40s, how much I actually enjoyed them. Because I think some of us maybe have you think back to school and we were forced to read these classics that maybe
Mhm.
were too advanced for where our reading level was at that age. And it was just, I just had to read this to get it done for school and like take the
Yeah.
test and write the book report and never really took anything from it. But I've been pleasantly surprised at how accessible these books have been now that I'm reading them today.
I'm so glad you said that. There's a running conversation in my family about how some of the books, not all of them, but some of the books chosen for, especially in high school years, both here in the UK and in the US, they're just not great. They're just
Yeah.
not the best version of an author's work, but they're short. Or,
Yeah.
that somebody has decided that somewhere along the curriculum, everybody should read Ethan Frome, which is not really what her books were like. And so, I think it's such a shame when people get turned off by books that they don't love in class and then they never go back to that author again. When, if you actually love sort of gossipy, high society machinations and, rises and falls of character, Edith Wharton is such a great author to read, but
Yeah.
maybe not Ethan Frome.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, it's good to revisit it, listeners. If you haven't revisited the classics as an adult, you should try it. So
yes.
I am lucky enough, like our book club, we try to pick one classic a year as well that we like
Mhm.
add into our, we read Dracula, and I was shocked at how many pop culture references from today were in that novel. And I was like, I would have never known this was from Dracula unless I read it.
Yeah,
So it
there
was
you
fun.
go.
Well, you have been so gracious to bring a book flight with you today. Can you tell us how you chose these books?
Well, I was thinking about the Dressmakers of London, and what I loved so much about writing that book was the relationship between sisters, and I love seeing sisters and all aspects of sister relationships explored, how complex they can be, how contentious they can be, how loving they can be. So I thought maybe we would have a chat about some books about sisters.
Yes, I love it. Well, what's the first one you brought today?
Well, I suspect this is the one that you mentioned in your Century of Books, but I figured we'd start with a classic that I hope more and more people will read because it's truly a wonderful book. So it's I Capture the Castle by Dottie Smith.
Yeah.
Has one of the great opening lines of any book, which is I write this sitting in the kitchen sink. And it's a really lovely coming of age book with some coziness to it, but a bit of sort of wry observation and sharpness to it too. So it follows Cassandra, who is a young woman who is aspiring to be an author. She lives with her sister and her family in this falling down castle in the English countryside. It's all very romantic. They're stone broke,
Yeah.
and the big house that owns the castle, two American brothers buy it or inherit it, and they meet them. And her older sister Rose decides she is going to haul herself out of poverty by marrying one of these two men, ideally the elder one, who is actually set to inherit a lot of money. And it's all about Cassandra's observations of her own family, observations of these brothers, and her sort of learning and growing through the process. And it's just a fabulous book. I can't recommend it enough to people, especially people who are interested in writing and have aspirations to be a writer themselves.
Yeah. It's also a shorter book too. I actually did it as an
Yeah.
audio and I think it was under 3 hours of a book. So it's a very like easy read. Like you're not going to be in this for a while.
Yeah, there's a lovely coziness to it. And the fun fact, of course, is that Dottie Smith is more famous for having written a 101 Dalmatians.
Yes.
So you do have that kind of funny compare and contrast. But I think it's a really good way to ease into sort of a book that looks at family dynamics, but also specifically sister dynamics and all of the wonderful aspects of being sisters, that bond, but also some of the jealousy, some of the resentment, some of the things that can come up, especially when somebody comes into your home or somebody
Yeah.
comes into your family and starts to, let's say, shake things up a little bit, and people start to make decisions that you wouldn't necessarily have expected them to make.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a delightful book. So listeners, make sure you go read it. It's I Capture the Castle by Dodie Smith. And what's the next book you brought today?
So a little bit of a different type of book, bringing us a little bit more contemporary. This is a real comfort read for me, and I have reread it several times because it's such a comfort read. It's Garden Spells by Sarah Addison Allen. I love a little bit of a magical realism, witchy, gardeny thing going on with some of my books. So I thought about maybe, practical magic has this element to it too, but I think Garden Spells is really the comfort read for me.
Yeah.
So it's about a woman who has let's say she's not a witch. She has some sort of magical adjacent abilities. She's able to use herbs and flowers to project into the food that she makes for her catering company emotions. So she can make people at a wedding reception feel, huge joy and love through the flowers that she uses for her catering. And so she's living this life in a small town. There's a bit of town gossip around her family because there is this um, enchanted apple tree in the front garden. And the myth about this apple tree is if you eat one of the apples, you will see the most significant thing in your life, the moment of your life. And so she buries the apple. She tries to make sure nobody does that because people have seen some really bad things as well as really good
Yeah.
things. And so she is living her life, and her sister, who has been away for, I think, a decade, comes crashing into her life on the run from a bad ex with the daughter that she didn't know existed in tow. And it's about how everything sort of is upturned, but also her life becomes better for having her sister back in her life. And it sets off a chain of events that leads her to um, sort of settle some old scores, but also find new love. And there's a real warmth and coziness to this book. It's lovely
Yeah.
how it's written. It's set in North Carolina, and you can just sort of feel the warmth and, the beauty of that place and that small town that she's writing about through all the pages of the book. And it's just lovely. So it's one of my, if I'm feeling a bit sick, I'm feeling a bit run down, I need a bit of a boost, I will pick that book up and read it again.
Yeah, I also read this book and I remember thinking, I have to read everything this author has ever written because it was so good. And I had never heard of her before. I think I just grabbed it at the library by chance and I just
Mhm.
fell in love with this book. I think there is there's at least a second book in this kind of little series, but I don't know if there's more.
Yes, there's at least one more. I think there
Okay.
might be two.
Okay.
And I'm going to mix up all the titles if I attempt it. So
Yeah.
I will.
So if you love it, listeners, there's a nut you can read a few more.
Perfect. Exactly. And I think there's just something about that style. And again, that sort of very light magical realism, slight witchiness that I find very comforting about it. So yeah, if you're looking for that kind of mood, that might be one to look for.
Yeah, so that was Garden Spells by Sarah Addison Allen. And she's great with that magical realism. All her books have a touch of that. So if you like that and you find you like that, you'll adore those books as well. What's the last book you brought today?
Well, complete left turn from garden spells and I have to the castle, but one that I understand is a great favorite of yours.
Yes.
So I thought I would bring The Nightingale by Kristen Hanna. This was one of the first books that I read in the historical fiction World War II genre, which of course it's been a huge bestseller many times over, so I'm sure many people are familiar with it. But it's essentially about two sisters who have very, very different experiences in France during World War II. It's complicated and complex, so I'll do my best to just give a brief overview. But essentially, one sister is living in France and ends up having to board um, German officers and sort of has to figure out how to live her life in such a way where she is staying true to the things that she believes and the things that she believes are horrific happening in her village, but also keeping her daughter safe and trying to make sure that she is providing a life that becomes more and more difficult, of course, as food begins to become more scarce and resources, but also, quite frankly, as she sees her neighbors and friends who are Jewish being rounded up, and we know, of course, sent to concentration camps. She doesn't know what's happening at the time.
Yeah.
So there is that very difficult, dilemma that she's going through trying to protect her daughter. I believe it's her daughter. My
Yeah.
apologies, it's a
No, it
son
is.
instead.
No, it's a
Uh,
daughter.
doubting myself as I speak. And then her sister, who has been, I believe, at a finishing school when the war breaks out, and she ends up working for the French resistance. So, a very different existence than her sister. Her sister is more on the domestic, occupied side. She actually ends up being a part of resistance work. And there are things that happen as a part of her life. These two sisters are essentially apart for almost all of this book, but you're seeing these stories unwind. You're seeing how the war is affecting both of them. And then there is a moment at the end where you have I don't want to say a resolution to their relationship, but there is something that brings them physically together that is I think very satisfying as a reader. You finally, after a very long time of reading these two disparate stories, actually see them come together. This book also has a framing device, which I think is really interesting. It sort of touches on that dual timeline
Yeah.
narrative that's very popular. I've written it myself. And you don't know exactly who the person is, but there is an older woman who is going on a bit of a family quest, shall we say, and reconciling herself to things that happened during the war and bringing along a member of her family in that process to help them understand what exactly happened during the war to their family. So that is all very vague sounding, but it's a beautifully written book. It's very
Yeah.
it's very emotionally touching. It's a difficult subject, both on the woman trying to live through occupation side and also the resistance side. But I think very important because these are subjects that people should know more and more about. And I think, as historical fiction has become more popular in World War II, I think more people maybe are exposed to stories about the resistance and stories about what was going on in France than they would have been when the book was initially published, certainly outside of France. But it feels like this is a subject that is just you do not want to forget what happened. You do not want
Yeah.
people to discount what people went through. And I think one of the great things about historical fiction is that it's a way to teach people, it's a way to remind people, and it's a way to also, engage people in circumstances where they wouldn't necessarily pick up the history book and read it, but they're interested in the novel, and so
Yeah.
that continues that interest and that continues that knowledge being kept alive.
Yeah, I don't think that I think this is such a better way for us to learn history is through novels, right? Through stories, because then you're like, I think it's so much more memorable and it sticks with you because, like we talked about that empathy piece, or you can walk through someone else's shoes, whatever way you want to say that. Where like if I'm just reading from a history text, I'm not nearly the story is not touching me nearly as much. Versus like when I have a fictional character that I'm going through the ride with them.
Yeah, yeah. Having done a lot of the academic stuff, having a narrative and an emotional connection to a character really, really helps you,
Yeah.
I think, understand and retain a lot of, what it is that you're reading.
Yeah. Well, I think this is a great closing book to your book flight because it kind of brings it back to historical fiction. I actually, as you were talking, I'm like, I see similarities between the sisters where they also weren't quite understanding each other because they were in such different parts of France and what they were doing throughout the war effort. And like there was that, they didn't quite understand why one would choose this or the other would choose that, and they had that misunderstanding between one another in the novel
Yeah,
as well.
absolutely. Absolutely. So,
Yeah, so that
yes.
was The Nightingale by Kristen Hanna. Well, what we can do here is, Mom, if you have any questions or if you have anything you'd like to say, you can unmute yourself. We can add that in.
I really enjoyed the book,
Thank
The
you.
Dressmakers, and I think that one of the things that I took out of it was, when you try to not say something to somebody because you're trying to protect them, maybe that's the wrong thing to be doing. Maybe it's better to be upfront and not have created, um, what she thought, why Sylvia left, why she wasn't speaking to them, and didn't really understand what was behind the scene with her husband.
Mhm.
And I think that it's important to kind of maybe look at situations where you maybe protecting somebody and not being honest, or not telling, not that you're not honest, but not telling
Yeah.
sometimes is a hindrance versus being the better way to go is just to be upfront and say what you want to say. And
Yeah.
I that's kind of something that I took out of the book that I thought was helpful,
Thank
to
you. Thank
understand.
you. Yeah, I think it's very human to want to protect the people you love, right? And keep them from
Absolutely.
difficult things. And I think, it's also very human to at some point have to come to the realization that you're not actually helping them by doing that. You're creating more misunderstandings. And, ultimately,
Right.
sometimes what's really needed is a frank conversation, difficult as that can be, and frightening as that can be as well.
Yes. Yeah, I agree. But I did enjoy the book. It was wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I
I'm glad
passed
to
it on
hear.
to my sister. My
I was going to
sister
say
is
my
reading it
aunt
now.
is reading it too, so I
Perfect.
know she'll be tuning in as well.
We
So.
love word of mouth.
Yeah, I because we move so much with the military, I can't keep all of the books. So what I love to do, and it's my little way of actually, it made me think of when you were talking about your mom, is when I'm reading a book and if I'm thinking about someone as I'm reading it, I usually send a little card. Like I'll write them a short little letter, like I'm thinking of you and this book reminded me of you and I think you'll love it, and I'm always give the disclaimer, like, you don't need to give it back to me, but pass it along to someone else that you think. And I always think of it like as this book that's kind of traveling along, since I can't move all my books. The movers look at me like I'm crazy when they're like 10 boxes of books. I'm like, I know, I know. I don't think we've hit our weight limit yet though, so they're okay to go.
Good, good. Well, that's a lovely idea. I might borrow that from you because, as you can imagine, as an author, a lot of
Yeah.
books come into the house, and I do need to be conscious that I have a husband who lives there as well. So, um, you know, toppling piles of books maybe not the best thing in the world. So, I do try to make sure that if you can match somebody up with a book they might like, it's always very satisfying.
Yeah, and I think everybody loves receiving a little package in the mail. So I think it's just a great way to be like, I'm thinking of you, and here's a little
Yeah,
happiness for your day.
I like that very much.
Yeah. How I love to end our show here, Julia, is with our bonus pairings. And they're just a speed round of questions that you can answer really quick.
Oh
Are
boy.
you a rereader?
Um, Very, very limited rereader. I primarily I'm always looking for the next thing, so not usually.
Okay. What is one book you read that made you want to become a writer?
I specifically writing historical fiction. It was The Shell Seekers by Rosamund Pilcher.
Yes, I love that book. We must have very similar tastes in reads
I think
because
we do.
I adore that book. Okay, where is your favorite place to read?
Ooh, I am temporarily between homes at the moment, which sounds very dramatic. We're buying a house and living with family at the moment. So I love that actually this part of the house where I'm recording it right now. It's very quiet. I'm surrounded by books. I like being around books. It feels very cozy and very warm to me.
Yeah, absolutely. I could see that. It's a beautiful, beautiful room that you're in there.
Thank you.
Lastly, what are you reading next?
So I am reading Vanity Fair right now,
Okay.
and suspect what I will probably end up doing is reading some thriller that I can just absolutely get completely obsessed with and whip through. I love reading those books where it's just you can become a bit propelled by the narrative, and you have to know what's going to happen next and have to know what's going to happen next. So I'm not sure which one it's going to be, but it will probably be one of those.
Yeah, those page turners that keep you up too late.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Just one more chapter.
Yes. Well, thank you so much, Julia, for coming on the show today. I know your time is precious, and I appreciate all you've given me.
Oh, this has been so much fun. Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode today with Julia Kelly, including her book flight featuring sisters. We will be taking a break from the BFF Book Club for the summer, as I know it is a busy time of year for families. Our next meeting will be in September, featuring Emerson Ford, author of What the Silent Say. This novel is inspired by a remarkably true story and brought to life in cinematic detail. It's an unforgettable tale of courage, sacrifice, and the unbreakable bonds of family. This novel is also set during World War II in the Pacific Theater of War. It's a story about brothers and the family left behind on the home front. You can find the show notes for this episode or all about meeting the author with us on bookishflights.com. That's it for today. Thank you so much for listening. As Emma Thompson said, I think books are like people in the sense that they'll turn up in your life when you most need them. Cheers to you, dear readers. Until next time.